but I'm hoping that with the protests going on and our work today focused on environmental justice and the environment, that we also acknowledge the many people who have died without justice being applied to their lives. So if we could just, if people are okay with just taking a moment of silence to honor those who have fallen and were not given justice in their lives and in their last moments of their lives. So I thank you for being here. And this is a co-production of 6018 North and Edgewater Environmental Sustainability Project, which Renee, Mia, Justin, wait, no, Justin, right? Wait, Nicholas is your partner.
Burton.
Burton!
Of course.
Because this, sorry, Burton, because this idea actually came from Burton. And so we really wanted to think about how we could approach the idea of native planting as a community, but also given COVID-19, how can we do native planting inside when we can't all go outside? And so thank you to Burton for coming up with this idea. And we're honored to have Melissa Potter, who has written this beautiful book, Illuminated Feminist Seed Bank, who has spent all the years that she has been in Chicago really bringing about environmental justice and really acknowledging the many organizations and the many groups of people whose seeds and history have been left behind or swept aside. And so she's been honoring that through seeds of justice work and planting and seed saving, seed service. But I think I'll let Melissa say more about that and get us started. I just want to thank you all so much, and thank you, Melissa, for bringing us together.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And, you know, as we wrote to all of you, because my project works with amplifying the histories of people who have been left behind, whose histories are endangered, critically endangered by climate change, racism, and the economy, that we felt that this was a way to extend our social work together towards creating a more just society here in Chicago and hopefully beyond. The history of plants and seeds in this country is extraordinary, as I'm sure many of you know. And I'm just going to very briefly introduce you to the project and the scope of the work we do amplifying all of these histories. And then I'm going to walk you through what I hope will be empowering methods of working on any scale. I felt it was really important as part of this long-term work doing radical gardening and thematic plantings for an art project, for an art practice, to make sure that I considered not everyone, like myself, not everyone has access to the outdoors. Many people are living in apartment buildings. Many people are living in food deserts and in blighted areas that are more concrete than they are live space. So I want to, in my work going forward, I want to try to help people bridge that gap and create what they can indoors, and also to create the communities and networks that they need to access the outside that they deserve. So the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and share my screen. I'll just do a really brief history. Is everybody able to see this? Can you see the screen? Yeah. So this is the original Seeds and Service project. Seeds and Service is an ecofeminist paper making project, which was founded in 2014 on 8th and Wabash, which is the South Loop location belonging to Columbia College Chicago. You see some of our beds here. The one in the most in up front is the Bosnian Magic Garden. The project started as a relationship with the Jane Addams Hull House, which was our first seed bank that we worked with. And very quickly over time, we started working with the UIC Latino Cultural Alliance, the Experimental Farm Network, and Seed Savers Exchange, as well as the Zapatista community, to look at heirloom varieties and native plants with a very specific agenda to amplify the stories of women and to amplify the stories of women in agriculture and the relationships that they have had to sustaining their communities through growing. Very early on, we figured out through the Hull House wage maps, which were a study of the South Loop neighborhood, that this site actually sits on the site of a former brothel. There were more than 65 throughout the region. And so some of our first work was also in amplifying the lives of women who have been completely forgotten in their work as sex workers in the early days of Chicago and the Dearborn Station area. And we had a project to name seeds after some of these women who were unfortunately found in the homicide database. That was the only way to find out information about them. But through the UIC Latino Cultural Alliance and the seed swaps, which I'll talk about in greater detail in a little bit, those seeds have been cycling and even ended up coming back to us. So we've also participated in seed gathering and distributing in ways that we feel participate in diversity. The first thing I want to do, whoops, I don't know how to make my, here we go. So this is one of our projects, one of our years, I believe this was 2018. You can see that even though it is in a very windy corridor of the downtown, which I'll talk about some of the challenges planting in a city environment, we were lush, 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 and had everything from, as I mentioned, Zapatista corn. You see a little sign in the background for the War Gardens. The War Gardens were a relationship with the Experimental Farm Network to work with seeds from Syria, Iraq, Palestine, and other areas that are at war and whose agriculture is at risk due to violence and pollution. We also most recently had our book acquired by the Global Seed Vault, which is a very important player in the international conversation on heirloom seed management internationally, and the preservation of cultural and biological knowledge of people all over the world. So I just want to talk for a moment about the differences between heirlooms and natives. So heirlooms, the Seed Savers Exchange is probably the most well-known organization in the country that has been at the forefront of heirloom management. Heirloom seed management is, of course, about diversity, but it's about diversity on many levels. It's about biological diversity. It's also about cultural diversity. So in the millions of seeds that are held by Seed Savers Exchange, when they do their collection, they also collect the stories and histories about the seeds, how they were used. And so it was at the moment I started working with Seed Savers Exchange that I understood the extent to which seeds are also a cultural history of our society, and that it's very important to understand them as such. Maggie Puckett is my collaborator with the Seeds and Service Project, and we had a small grant to go to Seed Savers Exchange and do their seed saving training program. If you are ever able to go to Decorah, Iowa, and even visit the Seed Savers Exchange, it is a truly extraordinary place and again amplifies the history of the Midwest region. Heirloom plants are different from natives. So natives are plants that are indigenous to the region. And of course, because they're indigenous to the region, they grow properly in our region. This is why they are more drought resistant, they're more tolerant, because they've changed over time to develop in the biome that they are used to. I will say that everything I'm going to talk about today is in flux, of course, due to climate change. So the things that we knew about how natives grow have been in flux due to changing life cycles on the plants, changing growth cycles, heavy rains, high winds, drought, and overheating. So, you know, we also, as growers all over the country, we are in zone 6A, but the truth is that those things are very much in flux. So I just wanted to lay out the differences between heirlooms and native plants. And through the Seeds and Service Project, we participate in the cultivation and development of both of those. So what you're seeing here is my son's effort in sign making to plant seeds from the 2018 project at the Altgeld Sawyer Corner Farm. The Seeds and Service Project has multiple locations. We planted at the 8th and Wabash location for 5 years, at which point the Columbia College Chicago community decided to build our student center on it. At that point, I started making jokes about conceptual gardening, which ended up not being so far off from the truth. But it deepened our partnerships with people throughout the city. And so when we collect seeds, we try to very selectively choose people that we can send our seeds to so that we can actually have them come to fruition. One of my biggest concerns about seeds is that seeds are very serious. Seeds are entire life in and of themselves. They're known as a baby in a box with lunch. And I believe that every seed should find its place, that every seed should be planted towards the greater good. And so in the seed swaps, I try to go a little bit more local in really doing the kind of partnerships that will cultivate the plants that we're working with. These plants came in part from our children's survival garden, which was our theme from last year, looking at climate crisis and also food justice and access. Of these plants, none of them are endemic to the Midwest region. If I had to ask you which herb is a native to the Midwest region, I'm going to ask that as a question, and I'm going to give you a hint. Some of you may already know it, but the indigenous name of the city should give you the hint that you need for what herb, what edible herb plant that you can grow indoors is endemic to the Midwest. Does anybody know? If not, that's cool. I'm totally happy to give you that info. Anybody want to give that a shot? So it's the allium family, onion town, Chicago. Chicago was the indigenous word for allium, for stinky onion. And so though they're not totally clear which onion, they're pretty sure that it may have been wild chives or potentially wild garlic. So these things are, they grow beautifully indoors. So I will talk about how those things work. So when I'm looking at this picture was taken on March 15th. I did it as, my response. I've been in quarantine for 2 days. We started quarantining with our child on March 12th, and on March 15th, I decided to start planting indoors because I knew that I wasn't going to probably be able to get to the Altgeld Sawyer Corner Farm for some time. This is what it looked like on May 18th. I want to bring a few things to your attention. So seeds are not always so easy to grow. So, this is one of the issues with seeds. They can be a little slow to start and they have different growth cycles. What you're looking at here was a classic Chicago spring where things are still a little chilly and I didn't have a heat mat. So I'm going to talk for just a moment about evaluating your light situation and also what you're looking at here, which is a light kit and the different ways that you can work around that. But I think this would have been even more bold if I had used a heat mat, which goes underneath because heat ultimately when you're growing indoors is just as important. So one thing I want to talk about is evaluating your light situation. So many things will grow indoors. And one thing I want to show you, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment so I can show you that, for every, I'm going to go ahead and pin my video so I can just show you. For every rule, there's a rule made to be broken, right? So that's the beauty also of growing. But this is an apocalypse scorpion plant that was meant to be a seedling that never ended up getting planted, and it has flowers on it. And this has been going for over a year indoors on my bookshelf. So, you know, whatever I tell you, also know that there are exceptions to all of these rules, and that gardening, especially in the time of climate change, is also one of taking risk and enjoying what the possibilities are. South light tends to be superior if you have a window. South light and secondarily east light are the two light sources that do best for growing indoors. In Chicago's Zone 6A, even if you started seedlings, which usually for plants that require seedlings and have a longer growth cycle, 90 to 120 days, as opposed to something that has 60 days, and I'll talk about those varieties in a moment, those plants would probably not do very well on a south light before June, unless you had some kind of a greenhouse. They sell them. They're small glass greenhouses that can kind of pull light and heat. So it is possible, but developing seeds into seedlings often requires a light kit. But south light can be excellent. I live facing north, so there was never really a possibility for me to grow things without a light kit. Whatever I would try usually ended up being pretty peaked. So the light kits are semi-affordable. I mean, you can pick up the light kit, and I'll go back to my screen share to show you what it comes with. You can pick up this light kit for about $120. It comes complete with the light and the supporting system, the trays, and even the initial growing material and a hood to hold light and heat in. I have found it really the difference between growing and not growing. So I use this every season. And so for me, it's been a really wonderful investment. I also want to talk about seedlings. So I grew from seed, and I'm going to show you how to plant a seed and also how to how to split things that grow into seedlings and multiple plant holders. But in order to get seedlings that I would then plant out in my gardens that have the long growth cycles, many of the heirloom vegetables like tomatoes and peppers and chives and things like this, dill in particular, which is one of my personal favorites because it always reminds me of my Russian friend in Jersey City. Everything she cooks with smells like dill. It's like I'm back in her kitchen when I put dill in anything. These have longer growth cycles, and they like to have seedlings, which can start 6 weeks before like a May planting, and then they can be hardened off and moved outside. When I say hardened off, you can take a tray of the seedlings that you grow and you put them outside for a couple of days in those trays and keep an eye on them before you shock them by pulling them up and putting them into the ground. You can do what I'm doing, which is that I've just decided I'm going to try to transform my apartment situation into as green a space as I possibly can, and to study all the ways that I can contribute to creating garden kitchens for everyone. And that will include the ways that I can grow right on a windowsill as well, so that I can figure out what might work in zone 6A. I put a link in your, and I'll go ahead and put that back at the end. If you didn't download the Dropbox information, I'll put the link back in the Dropbox folder, or back in the chat to the Dropbox folder, which is a link for download. And it's a link for my favorite growing station, which I think is the most reasonable for what you get. So then there's questions about which herbs and plants grow well indoors versus outdoors. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can show you some of my babies. So I just am going to show you some of the assortment of the things that I've found work really, really well in a home environment. Basil is a win-win, win-win all the time. Basil grows incredibly well. This one, as you can see, is already quite robust, and it was from seed. So I planted these seeds in March. Who doesn't love dill? Basil. Basil is just an incredible, wonderful plant, and of course, it's very aromatic. It is endemic to the Mediterranean region, but it is not endemic to the United States, although I, of course, consider it really a wonderful addition to a healthy kitchen. Oregano. So this little guy, oregano, that's a little bit slower to start, but you can see we're starting to get some nice growth. And I'm going to talk in a minute about thinning and the ways these can also be planted out into other environments. Parsley is a big win. This guy is also from seed and was planted even later. This is only like a month worth of growth. I'm in love with this parsley. And parsley also, many of these plants have medicinal properties too. And I'm going to show you in a minute how we catalog the information so that we can track which plants have which applications. And then I have many more, but I also wanted to show you Calendula, which is a medicinal herb. You notice, and I'm going to talk in a moment, I'll demonstrate how to actually do a planting, but I've been using everything recycled. I didn't want this year to buy anything with the exception of the soil that I needed. So I really have been trying to recycle everything that I use. Let me just go back to the screen sharing for a moment. Okay. And so, let's see, there we go. So I wanted to show you a picture of how the Seeds and Service Project organizes our information. Every year we have thematic gardens. They range from our war gardens to Maggie Puckett's relationship with the Zapatista community to help steward corn diversity, to a relationship I developed with the Bosnian diaspora to really look closely at the traditional herbal medicine of women in that region. This one is from our Roe v. Wade garden. We did a lot of work around medicinals as radical material to divest from the pharmaceutical industry and to strengthen local communities. So if you notice here, we have information as we can collect it on what the specific uses are for women. That could be anything that you decided to really dig into in terms of what those plants are for. Other uses that might be therapeutic or even spiritual and ritual based. The part of the plant that is used medicinally, native to, meaning is it native or endemic to this region, its light needs, its days to maturity, which define whether something is a seedling transplanted outdoors or whether it can be direct sowed, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Planting instructions, and then as I mentioned earlier, we use these for an art practice. So at the end of the day, all of our plants serve a paper making practice. And I'll talk a little bit later about the Lurie Garden and the ways that you can be involved in the Lurie Garden's native plant sales that they do annually. But we use these plants to produce into handmade paper at Columbia College Chicago and in our art practice. And we call our method nose to tail in the sense that we collect seeds, we use things medicinally in a culinary way, we study them, and then we can use the leftovers in order to produce handmade paper. So a lot of the things that we're also trying to chart is how they can be used in that manner and whether they can be, whether they're perennial or annual, and how we need to kind of work in that regard. So next, what I want to do is I just want to do a quick demonstration for you on how you can recycle and start making plants in your home environment. I just want to show you a couple of others. I mean, you know, again, we didn't have a whole lot. This is my little bit sad catnip. My cat actually went after it, which is a good thing. But catnip comes from a plant version that is also very medicinal. It's in the calamint family. There are many medicinal uses for the tea of catnip. So you and your cat can get down with catnip. But you'll notice I used an old water bottle. I poke holes in the bottom of the water bottle, and that's for drainage. I was using a knife. It's not enough. So my recommendation would be to take a drill, if you have it, and drill 4 holes in the bottom so that you get full drainage, because the drainage is really important so that the seedlings don't get waterlogged. But you can use anything like this. My personal favorite right now are berry containers, because if you notice, they already have slats in them and they drain really well. So if you have a tray that you're putting these in, they're perfect because you can water them and then they dry out. And that part of that drying out is really important to get things to work properly. Okay, so this, I'm crazy about these. I'm keeping tons of these. So I'm just gonna push this down so you can kind of see from this angle. So different seeds have different needs in terms of how deep you actually plant them. This is a Chinese food container, also with things on the bottom, so you can see my holes so that they drain out. Okay, filled with organic. I always use organic soil. All of our work is about not just using organic, but also supporting the farms that produce this material, which we consider really important. So I filled it. It's not packed. It's fairly loose. It's not too loose, but it's fairly packed. Okay. And I have different types of seeds. I'm actually going to plant some poppies today. I just found out that poppies are illegal to grow. Is that true? But anyway, we grow them every year and have, I guess because they can be soaked in alcohols for medicinal purposes. They're not technically legal, but anyway, they're stunning to look at. They are a wonderful pollinator plant, and of course attract many very healthy bugs and bees, which is very important to a garden. You want to have certain types of plants that will attract the pollinators. There are many different types of pollination. There's wind pollination and also insect pollination. So it's important to have a variety of that in any kind of garden. So I'm going to do these and see if I can get them to be seedlings for my indoor environment. I do want to say that it's very difficult to get plants to be fruit producing or flower producing indoors. They usually need the real length of sun that happens over the course of a day in order to fruit. Again, rules are made to be broken. I've got a couple of completely adorable and wonderful flowers, which also indicate that they may fruit. So I'm putting it back up underneath the lights. I had it on the bookshelf. I'm putting it back up under the lights, and I'll let you know it's possible. These are very small seeds, so I just want to show you how small they are. See how tiny those seeds are? Okay, so they get planted a little bit differently. These are dill seeds. You'll see that the size is much bigger, okay? And these are catnip seeds, also bigger. A lot of seeds want about 1/4 of an inch of depth. So what I usually do, I have these from my kids' home projects, but you can use a pencil. You can even use the back of a fork. You don't need to buy anything in order to do this. Again, it's really wonderful to recycle as much as possible. And what I do is I make like a little hole into which I would drop my material. And then I can put my plants in and then cover it up. What I'm doing today is actually casting on the surface and then putting a light sprinkling on top. So when you have little seeds like this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take them and cast them over the top. The more the merrier. I'll talk for a moment in a minute about doing thinning. Okay, so I've got these all over the place. And then I take a little bit of extra soil and I put just a dusting, just a little dusting on the top, just to hold them into place, especially if these are being direct sown. This helps keep them from flying away and getting into other things, but it also holds the water on top and below the plant. And then what I would do is I would water this very carefully and make sure that it was well watered for as many days as it took to germination, not to let it fully dry out. This will go underneath my grow light. And then I'll let you know what happens. I'm interested to see because I've never tried to grow poppies indoors. So now what I want to do is I want to talk about thinning, because that's really important too. If you notice in here, I've got, this was what it looks like when you have seeds that have been scattered and you get a lot of growth. in order to make a plant as strong as possible, once they get kind of to this size, it's good to go in and thin out the little guys, because they also are drawing from the plant, drawing from the material of the soil. And you want to create as much health as possible. So one of the things that you could do in this situation was very, very gently pull them out, take the individual plants, use the method that I mentioned with a stick to create a little hole to put it down into, and create individual plants from all of these different seeds, okay, all these different seedlings. Now, a lot of these plants, we're talking about heirlooms. Now what I want to do is I want to switch over to native plants, and what the difference is between building seedlings direct sow and then overwintering and seed stratification, which is a bit more complex. But a lot of the native plants and medicinals can be what's called direct sown, meaning that when it's time for the season, which can be any time after the frost, but today I tend to be a little bit more careful because the climate change is creating a bit of a flux in terms of when the final frost would actually be. Direct sow plants can be planted right into your well-amended, well-turned over soil outdoors, and they include many, many grasses and natives, black-eyed Susans, milkweeds, these different kinds of plants. Some of the seeds require that they be scarified. I don't know if you all have heard of that methodology. Okay, I see some no, so I will explain it. They have a hard shell, and the hard shell is what protects them. And it also protects them from being eaten by birds. So they literally can be sanded, or they can be pre-soaked before they're planted. So when I say direct sow, some plants need intervention in order to direct sow. A lot of vegetables can also be direct sown. Cabbages, beans, and things like this can start. And again, we always go back to, well, what's the growth cycle? I didn't know dill has a longer growth cycle. I was like, well, that sucks. I guess all our seeds from last year didn't work. No, patience is a virtue. They had a much longer growth cycle than the basil. The basil was like, boom, 60 days, we're ready, we're mature. The dill started creeping up far, far longer than that. Oregano, same thing. It's true of all the different plants. Direct sowing is for plants that have a shorter growth cycle. Those that have longer growth cycles, we can start with seedlings and then take the seedlings and plant them outdoors. Direct sow has a couple of methodologies that need to be considered with natives. Many of the natives are perennial, which means that they come back year after year. This is also great too, because they are often drought resistant, water, not as water needing. And they will reseed and replant over and over again. A lot of our native grasses, like buffalo grass, red switchgrass, which is my personal favorite to look at, but also to plant and use for paper making. This can be direct sown, but this question about cold stratification, one thing I really learned, and I think Norman was talking about this when we met earlier, he tried to do what's called cold stratifying, which is basically to shock the plants through a system of putting them in the refrigerator for 2 weeks, taking them out, and then planting them to shock them into believing that a winter has occurred. That can be very tricky. And the way that I dealt with that was often to plant them in the fall. Then they got their full cold season. They would sometimes come up in the spring, but I found with some of the natives that they were on a 2-year cycle. Maybe they didn't come up the first year. Patience is a virtue with native plants. Maybe they didn't come up the first year. Next year they came up. Even if they came up the next year, many of these plants actually don't bloom until the next year, or become fruit bearing or flower bearing until year 2. But again, they are an investment in the future because many of them will come back again. I want to talk for a moment about the different seed libraries that you can hook up with and the ways that you can access both heirloom and native plants. Native plants are in this area, you can do container pot planting if you don't have a backyard, but you have a backyard space. They will do often very well in containers. Sometimes this is just a question of experimentation, but it's a lot of fun, and you'll always be amazed. The thing that's so wonderful about gardening is it is constantly humbling and changing every time you're trying to do something. Let me go ahead and share my screen again to talk to you about my personal favorite local seed library. The UIC Heritage Garden, which is part of the Latino Cultural Alliance, does a lot of focus on indigenous and native planting. They also have a seed library and an annual swap. And during that annual swap, for anybody who's interested in planting, I highly recommend attending this swap. This year, of course, was canceled. They may end up doing some kind of a virtual event. But I highly recommend this because they do both heirlooms and heirloom varieties of vegetables, but also native grasses and plants that are representative of the indigenous nature and plants that existed in the region. They also will introduce you to a lot of farmers, both individual and small organization, that are very involved with the intersection of food justice, racial justice, climate justice, and gender justice. So a lot of these organizations are doing multiple things. I think of one of my favorites, the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, which produces over a ton of food for its local community in a community garden that's on the site of a former Superfund site. They are a Latinx organization, and they are completely freaking amazing. They often are represented here, but it's a great way to learn about who are the players in our region doing this seed library work. I also want to bring your attention to Seed Savers Exchange, because not only can you buy seeds directly from them, they also are working now on data banking so that you can find and share seeds and literally create a relationship, almost like a pen pal situation with somebody to find seeds that you may be looking for. And I'll give you an example. I'm doing a lot of work with flax, and I've been really interested to get the fiber producing flax, which is not so easy to find. I might be able to find a local person who's been developing that seed in an heirloom way so that I can grow it in zone 6A when in fact it grows better in other zones, if that makes sense. So these can be very important to work with people who've developed the stability of plant in the area that we're working with. I am going to end with the Lurie Garden and then open it up for your questions. I'm sure all of you have been to the Lurie Garden. If you haven't been to the Lurie Garden, it is an extraordinary space in downtown Chicago, right across the street north from the Art Institute of Chicago. They do not so one of the most ecologically important, and I want Tricia to know this too, because some people don't realize this. I did a lot of work with an environmental studies student at Columbia on our garden. And one of the things over time I grew to understand is the best way to protect plant pollinators and insects who will be healthy for the biome of your garden is to not cut it down and to let it go to seed and to be totally overgrown and not look beautiful in the ways that Americans are used to manicured things. The Lurie Garden considers itself an educational project as much as a prairie restoration project. And so they do a mowing every year. And so 3 years ago, I developed a relationship with Joanna Kubiak, who's a complete rock and roll superstar. And she wanted me to come in and identify which plants that they could clear cut would be used for hand paper making. And over the past 3 years, we've been going through all of these plants and different parts of the plants that are useful for hand paper making. Many of them are in the stem, some of it's in the leaf. Grass is extraordinary. As I mentioned, red switchgrass is just, it's like my soulmate. It's beautiful to look at alive, and it's incredible for fiber. It's stunning. Not also to forget all the other craft arts that plants in the indigenous community and also in more contemporary work that plants play a role in. All different kinds of basket weaving, furniture building, and different kinds of plant uses from these materials are present still through our intangible heritage practices here and nationally. So this is a picture of me. I'm working on a film right now about the history of the Center for Book and Paper's founder, Marilyn Swart, who was a gardener. All paper makers usually go back to gardening for source material. And this is part of my work doing the sourcing. You'll see in the front, we've got a lot of Echinacea. We've got yarrow and different types of flower producing plants. And then I want to bring your attention to their very robust website. So you can visit their plant, if you go to the tab here that says Plant Life, you can actually search for plants that are medicinal, grasses, blooming, and in different categories to try to look for the things that you're interested in. I pulled up black cohosh because black cohosh is endemic to this region. It also is a powerful medicinal, very particular to work with women healers around women in all life cycles, from menstruation to childbirth to menopause. This is a very powerful plant that both the indigenous and non-indigenous communities use for health and wellness. A lot of our native species have those potentials, and it's really interesting to think about how they can be used in that manner as well, particularly given the world that we live in today. But the plant life section of this website is wonderful. It will give you all kinds of information about how to plant properly, how to take care of these. I will give you a piece of advice that I found particularly helpful as I was working throughout the years. More can be more in a garden, which is to say that not everything works. So when you are thinking about success, it's great to try a number of things out. And sometimes a lot of things will work, and sometimes only one thing will work. But that's just the nature of a garden. And then sometimes it'll surprise you the next year and something will pop up you weren't expecting. So native planting in particular can sometimes feel a little punishing up front, but once it gets started, it's robust in ways that are really amazing to watch. Lurie Garden also twice a year. I don't know how this is going to work with COVID, but for those of you who are interested, I have an ongoing relationship with them, and I can certainly ask any questions and let you know what I find out from them. But the Lurie Garden has a semi-annual, as I understand, plant sale. So you can buy seedlings as opposed from working with seed. Seedlings tend to be more robust. It is not cheating. Some people feel that using seedlings is cheating. It's not cheating. It's a great way to get a robust plant that has a higher degree of success. Seed saving and partnerships through seeds are a different form of communication with other communities, and they're obviously way more transportable. I think of a lot of workers who bring seeds in internationally, and all of the political implications today about what it means, for instance, for the Zapatista community to be sending corn varieties that we no longer have in this country across borders to me as a grower to plant here. She can't, the members of that community can't do that with seedlings most of the time. You can't do live plants overseas. So they have very specific political ramifications and meaning. But seedlings are totally cool, and they're a great way, particularly for people who are less seasoned with growing, to get their party started and to contribute to creating an environment, that's more sustainable. More sustainable in many ways, more in touch with our indigenous communities and the language and knowledge of their plant wellness knowledge. more in touch with what will work for more communities, right? The time to end yards is now. I mean, it's been true for a long time, but it's time to end yards. Yards can very easily be native plants and things that are more usable for our overall health and well-being, and also for flooding and for, you know, the rain system and ecosystem within the city. I want to give you guys time. I think I covered pretty much everything that I wanted to. In this form that I wrote you guys, again, there are a bunch of links to different organizations that can reinforce some of the things that I talked about and give you ideas for how you grow in Zone 6A. Native plants and different types of issues around soil preparation. You know, a lot of the drought resistance plants like sandy soil, but they can be pretty forgiving as long as it's not the soil is not too dense. Yeah, and so again, I'll end my presentation and then hand it over to you for questions.
Thank you, Melissa. Does anyone have any questions?
I do. What are your favorite medicinal herbs to eat?
Oh, that's a really interesting one. Well, I'll say that I feel like a lot of medicinal plants get a bum rap because they're also known as weeds. And so I feel like I am their proponent. So for instance, burdock can get really overrun and people get so mad at burdock. I'm like, but burdock is the jam. It has, again, nose to tail. Its root is a great medicinal. Its leaves can be eaten. Its seeds are very easy to harvest. So I'm a big fan of burdock. It will take over your life, so be careful.
Are those the ones that have really big leaves? Like
it does. It does. And the burrs, so I do a lot of work with women's craft, and the symbol of the burdock, a lot of the symbols that you see in rugs that look like this, that kind of Navajo kind of like stepped pattern, have some of their origin in the burdock. It was considered in a lot of cultures the evil eye protector from the evil eye. In fact, one moment. So, in addition to using the seeds, I also collect the burdock because I've been giving these out as sort of spiritual protectors to people I felt needed them. But, the burrs stick on animals. People get very annoyed with burdock. Burdock's a tough customer. I also love mugwort. Mugwort is a really great one. I mean, that's just like basically a weed. And if you, if you find it and you know what you're looking for, it has tremendous, tremendous ability. But I'm also happy to share the plants that we grew in our garden. Like I can send you a copy of the Feminist Seed Bank. What's the thing called? Excel spreadsheet that lists the plants. Rue is another one I absolutely love. You have to be really careful with rue because it will burn your skin. I did a video a couple years ago and I had I was like, what the? And I had like rue burn all over because the oil is very intense. But it's a great culinary herb. The Latino community uses rue as a culinary herb. It's also a potential abortifacient. I'm a sage girl. I love sage. You really shouldn't ask this question because I go, I just write down this. Sage, I used sage a lot in the curated tea events I did with the Bosnian community. Sage is really good for tooth health, particularly now when all of us have to cancel usually we're canceling a lot of our non-urgent health care needs. And so using a tea of sage to swish around in your mouth is very protective and antibacterial. So that's a really good one. Yeah, I could keep going, but I'll let somebody, yeah. Did you have a question?
There's a question. Oh, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay. Do you have any particular favorite pairings of plants that just go well together, like ecologically or just aesthetically?
So are you talking about companion planting?
I might be.
Yeah, companion planting, basically plants that work with each other to, yeah. So, I mean, we invoked the Three Sisters methodology because we felt that it was, you know, invoked a lot of the metaphor of the ecofeminism that we're working with. And it also is an indigenous methodology. The Three Sisters methodology uses corn, squash, and beans. And the idea is the beans grow to create shade for the squash that will grow underneath them and then can be sort of scaffolded with the corn. So that basically you get like a multi-tiered ecosystem within it. And so it's called the Three Sisters planting method. I love that method. That's for vegetables. What the thing that I think is really important to do anytime you find a plant that you're interested in working with, research its companion plants because it varies. It varies a lot depending on light, shade gardens, highlight gardens. You know, usually I was planting plants that were bee pollinated together. You have to be very careful with wind pollination, that there are certain plants that can cross pollinate, right? So if you're looking for seed, to the maintenance of seed, you know, for heirloom management, you have to be very careful because, like, for instance, cucumbers and squashes can cross-pollinate. Corn can cross-pollinate. We used a lot of tassel bags, and Maggie actually designed tassel bags with messages on them so that they were an art intervention too, but we covered them so that they wouldn't cross-pollinate with the different varieties we were using. A lot of herbs are natural companion plants, but you have to be careful because some of them will scoot out other plants. So like wormwood, which I love, it's the basis of absinthe and it smells great. And I want to experiment with its pithy core for paper making. It's a tough customer too. Burdock, you know, you got to be careful of ones that they may be endemic, but they're actually really, you know, bold in terms of how much space that they'll take up. Oh no, I planted squash and cucumbers by each other. Whoopsie. Yeah, I mean, you never know, but you'll know because shit will start to go down. So it's like, what's going on? You know, these were supposed to be Yugoslavian finger squash and they're like, you know, some kind of like freaky hybrid thing, you know, and not all of them will do that. But due to climate change, we have a lot more wind happening now. You know, these sort of extreme, also powder mildew is a huge problem because we get these torrential rains. Now, again, I'm speaking about gardens that are more vegetable plant. That's not as true, although it's very true with like echinaceas. You know, there's certain plants like that that are prone to powder mildew. And once powder mildew gets into a garden, it spreads over the entire garden. Neem oil is the only somewhat effective pharmaceutical or whatever method to try to control powder mildew. But you know, you also have to deal over time with pests and different environmental issues. Yeah.
Sorry about that. Do you have any recommendations for high wind areas?
Yeah.
Because, you know, we're on the 9th floor of a medium-sized building and we're very close to the shore. A lot of wind issues here.
I wish that you know, it wasn't the time of COVID because I would donate some wind protectors to you. We bought a lot of wind protectors for our papermaker's garden at 8th and Wabash. They make them, they're like little tents you can put over your plants. And I highly recommend using them, especially when you know it's going to be a high wind day. You can also create sort of like wind barriers. I don't know if you're on a terrace, but the reason people put in those kind of like bamboo things, you know, around their terrace is not just for privacy. They can be wind blocking. Certain plants like corn, for instance, you know, will block plants. But I mean, the wind was so intense down at 8th and Wabash, sometimes we'd come out and, you know, it will have pulled stuff up and pushed it over to the side. Things that are lower growing can be a little more wind resistant, especially too if you tent them and also protect them. But if you're able to create sort of like a barrier, if you have light that will come in like this, then you can create a barrier around and maybe cut down some of the wind. But again, take a look at wind protectors. They actually make them, and they're like plastic mesh that you can put around your plants.
Hinda has a question about recommendations for flowering native plants that don't spread too much and bunnies don't like. All of her milkweed and cardinal flowers have been eaten.
I don't actually have a really good, I'd have to really go back and look at my, I'll tell you what, I would take a look at the Lurie Garden's list of plants. I mean, for instance, maybe bee balm. Was bee balm one of the ones that the bunnies were going after? Some of the ones that are real high shooting, the bunnies might have less, but you know, bunnies can be like really tough. I mean, they're very difficult to keep from.
They don't like anything that's spicy. So anything that has pungent odors or...
Well, I mean, you know, chives are flowering, right? All the allium family are flowering plants. They're very beautiful. I mean, you know, some of them have that kind of like snowball, beautiful flower on it. What were the ones, Hinda, that the bunnies are going after hard?
Milkweed and cardinal flower.
Oh, darn it. Yeah. Black-eyed Susans. I'm not sure if bunnies are big fans of black-eyed Susans, but I see them with great consistency, which leads me to believe that they have a high degree of success. Echinacea, again, also some of the plants are kind of spiny. Their leaves are a little bit more spiny. Echinacea and the plants that have like bristles, you know, like on the bast on their on the undersides of their leaves. Bunnies are not going to be going after burdock. There are, and I know at Altgeld Sawyer Corner Farm, they struggle with bunnies a lot. You know, they get like resident bunnies who take up space. Yeah, Hinda, anybody who's interested, I love researching this kind of stuff. I mean, love researching it. So, you know, that's the kind of thing that Joanna Kubiak at Lurie Garden, if I shot her an email, I said, in fact, I'm gonna go, what are bunny resistant natives? And then I can report that back to Trisha, who can distribute that information.
Well, Mary also has a question about, she's got squirrel and bird problems with corn and sunflower seeds.
Oh yeah. You know, this is just a huge issue. And I might also say rats can be a problem. So, you know, the vermin issue is real, and trying to do food-based gardening can be a real pain in the neck. Most people, if they've got it like out in a backyard, have to create some kind of a barrier system, either with chicken wire or what we had at 8th and Wabash, which I thought was brilliant. We had, and I can't remember her name, but we had an incredible woman who designed our space. And the beds were all high. They were all not 10 feet. They were like 4 feet high, corrugated metal. So the vermin and animals weren't able to get up into them. So this might be another strategy too, that if you build something up, that you consider going significantly as high as possible and using flashing or something that it's more difficult for them to climb up. That was the strategy we used at 8th and Wabash.
I have an addition to that for like a mind shift on that. So in permaculture tactics, it's that you give a third of your garden to the animals. So you also could just plan for that and like give them what they want and just let them have it, and then do a third for seed and then a third for eating.
Yeah, and that's how Altgeld Sawyer seems to be dealing with it. You know, they have a resident bunny, and people try to sort of like trellis around things. But yeah, they bring all their friends, Mary says. Yeah. I mean, you know, and again, this gets into all kinds of questions about climate change in this new global moment where people are not out as much to scare away vermin. So I hate to say it, but this year we're probably going to see an uptick in, my bunnies eat it all, but we're probably going to see an uptick in this because people aren't out there to scare them off in the same way, you know. And I feel in the era of climate change, every season comes with new rules. That really was something that I had to adjust to, that my knowledge base was not static at all. I am really concerned about rats too, because rats apparently are really stoked about this new moment where humans are not out as much.
Does anybody else have any questions? I hate to end it on rats.
Rats are just trying to eke out a living, man. You know,
Yeah,
they're just
like the rest of us. Mia?
I have a very, very general houseplant question, but I thought I might as well ask it. When you mentioned like drilling holes in the bottom of your upcycled containers and just like drainage in general, I also remember reading a bit ago that some people put pebbles or small rocks at the bottom of their pots for drainage.
Yeah.
Do you have like a preferred best practice or anything that you think works better?
I think that's great. And some people also lighten their soil with perlite and different, you know, some mixes will actually have that in, so they'll drain more, but rocks are great. And you can do like, you know, depending on what your plant needs, you can do like a third at the bottom with rocks. When you're working with a container like this, I just recommend getting a soil, you know, and then what I need to do is really make sure my drainage is good, because it will dry out. That perlite will make it dry out very readily. Basically, when I'm doing seedling work, I know that I haven't drilled enough holes if it's not draining like every other day, if it's not dried out. But for plants, yes, you can do that. The other thing too is over time, houseplants get very compacted. Their soil gets very compacted. And this is why people also use Miracle-Gro and things to kind of like try to amend the soil. But, you know, it can shock plants, but over time they do like to be replanted in looser soil and soil that's got all the nutrient base sort of like built back into it. And even though perennials come back, they need care, right? I mean, if you look at like a bulb, I mean, bulbs can go wild for a few years, but then every few years they need to be split in order to maintain them, right? So, you know, it's just deferred maintenance as opposed to, you know, annual maintenance. Houseplants need the same care and attention too.
Awesome.
Thank you very much,
Thank you,
Melissa, for actually ending on what we all need to be doing, care and attention and intentionality as to what we're planting and what we're wanting to see in the future. So thank you all very much for joining us today, and especially Melissa for leading us in that intentionality and care.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to work with all of you, and I will follow up on bunny-resistant natives. Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Be safe.
Bye-bye.
And supportive.
Thank you.
Hey, Renee.